Oh, I might start us off because we've got lots of interesting things to talk about. So, good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining the second webinar in Mutual Ventures Delivery Campaign series. My name's Anya, and I'm one of the consultants at Mutual Ventures, and I'll be chairing today's conversation, which is all focused on gripping and delivering outcomes. So, as I mentioned, this is the second webinar in our delivery campaign, and in our first webinar last week, colleagues reflected on the power of investing in relationships to enable programmes to succeed. Before we get into the topic of today's webinar and hear from our wonderful panelists, I just wanted to reflect quickly on what we mean by delivery when we're talking about delivery in this campaign. By delivery, we mean enacting government policy to deliver specific and measurable outcomes. On big public service reform programmes, there's often a tension between the centre needing to grip and measure progress and the local teams responsible for implementing and knowing relationships on the ground. We see this play out on a daily basis. So targets and measures have traditionally been seen as a way of understanding, tracking and driving the delivery performance, but this focus can lead to perverse outcomes. When used, these tools need to be applied intelligently based on what is needed in a place and in the context of existing systems. They must also allow the development of the right relationships and culture at a local level where it really matters. There are pitfalls to avoid. Getting this right is a balance between being clear about what a policy or programme is expected to ultimately achieve while not being overly prescriptive. It's important to have clear measures of success from the outset of a programme to help articulate when outcomes have been achieved. But we also know that an over-focus on tightly defined targets and systems of personal reward and progression can lead to a focus on evidencing achievement of specific KPIs rather than delivering genuine change for communities. In this webinar, we'll reflect on how you can get this balance right, including how to identify some of the right things to measure and when, the role of leaders in setting the right culture to enable the delivery of outcomes, and how and when outcomes should be set and delivered at a national or local level. Before we get into our discussion, I'm going to ask each of our three panelists to introduce themselves, a brief background about why they're here today. So Sarah, I wonder if I can start with you.
Hi, Anya. Yes, I'm Sarah Jo Hull. I'm the National Adoption Strategic Lead working with regional adoption agencies from across the country as part of Adoption England. Previous to that, I set up One Adoption West Yorkshire, which was the first regional adoption agency to go live in the National Reform Programme.
Thanks, Sarah. Lovely to have you here today. Kate, could I come to you next?
Hello, everyone. Great to be here. My name's Kate Ardern. I'm a doctor by background, a former Director of Public Health for Wigan Council, where I was part of the team that put together the Wigan deal. And currently, I'm an Honorary Professor of Public Health at Salford University, and I'm here today as the co-chair of the Restate Reimagining Health Expert Advisory Council. We've put out several reports on things like neighbourhood health, immunisation and vaccination, and of course, reimagining the healthcare system around devolution.
Thank you, Kate. Lovely to have you here. And last but not least, Louisa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Louisa Mitchell. I'm the Chief Executive of All Child, formerly West London Zone for Children and Young People. We were inspired by the Harlem Children's Zone in New York, hence the name, now called All Child. And I was part of the founding team who led the first listening and co-design of our community-led system of support in West London, and have led the growth across Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington and Chelsea, Westminster and Brent, and now up into Wigan and the Greater Manchester area, and starting to do listening and co-design in other places around the country too.
Well, thank you. Great to have you all here today. And thank you all for introducing yourselves. So we're going to get into the discussion. Please do pop any questions you have as we go through the webinar in the chat, and we'll try and get to them during the discussion. So to kick us off, I wonder, Kate, if I can come to you first and ask, what are your reflections on how to grip delivery and hold teams to account without losing sight of the overall outcomes you're trying to achieve?
It's the great creative tension, isn't it, Anya, in terms of what nationally traditionally plays out in terms of top-down performance management. And you see that a lot in the NHS, for example, which obviously I used to work in, where you have lots of KPIs that are focused around process and not outcomes and activity. So what you're measuring is widgets. You're not actually measuring success. And that really clashes with the, if you like, the devolution culture of local government. And by the way, I much preferred working in local government to the NHS, if that's that may come as a surprise to people. Where you need to be able to co-create what success looks like with local people. It needs to be meaningful to the citizens we serve. And I think that's a really, really sort of big problem with the system as currently envisaged. And it's partly because we've been a very centralised, Whitehall-driven focus. So what I'd like to see nationally are some broad outcomes of measures of success, and then co-creation at you might say a strategic authority, combined authority level, working with the mayors in terms of the devolution framework, and at a local and neighbourhood level on what the success measures look like for place. And that needs to include narrative descriptive measures of outcomes, not just statistics. The numbers only tell you one thing. You need to be able to set that in context with the, if you like, the demography, the geography, the history, the culture of place, and what is meaningful in terms of local people's success. That means letting go of control and power. And that, I think, is the big, if you like, battle in the system between the way Whitehall envisaged things and the way in which local people envisage things.
Real, thank you, Kate. And I think we'll come on to some of that kind of power struggle, to put it one way, when we talk a bit also about the role of leaders in delivering and gripping outcomes. Sarah, I wonder if I could come to you on the same question, and your views on how you balance gripping kind of delivery and making sure something's delivered on time, particularly from your experience, for example, of the RAAs, without losing sight of the overall outcome you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Kate touched on that about the kind of lived experience of people who are kind of accessing services. And I think our sort of way that we've focused on this is that one of our key outcomes is making sure that adopters, birth families and adopted children, kind of that they're sort of, we really understand their perspectives in order to then think about how you evaluate whether you've actually done anything different in terms of an impact of on their day-to-day life. You know, I think really that shared responsibility, particularly working with 34 regional adoption agencies, we want to focus on a shared purpose and think about how we think about that culture change that we're trying to achieve, and how we look at meaningful outcomes going further than compliance. So actually, what does it mean to those families? And very particularly thinking about qualitative information, that actually case studies, the real lived experience of people is really important to hear about what's important to them. And we work quite closely with young people, adopted adults, and adopted families and birth families to really say what's important to you and how do we measure that. So how do we ensure that we kind of, with our big national adoption sort of vision around Adoption England, how does that translate into the day-to-day lives of everybody who's on the ground in those 34 regional agencies and then in their local authorities? Which can be very, very challenging. But I kind of agree with Kate that seems like a very sensible way forward.
Real, thank you, Sarah. And Louisa, I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to share on that kind of balancing delivery with maintaining sight of overall outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I come at it from a very local and I guess I don't really like this expression, but because we don't use it, but bottom up sort of perspective. I mean, when we designed our first our model in our first community in White City in West London, we did a deep listening project to understand why families were so struggling to navigate the system and get the support and opportunities that they needed and wanted for their children. And when we really listened, we understood that it was the way the funding was working that was creating that fragmentation and those problems. And so we very much then, with local stakeholders, designed an outcomes framework that we could all deliver into and that everybody paid into. And that was done at the local level, and it was really challenging. You know, it's not easy to agree with schools and different council services and community organisations and us and families, you know, what are the right outcomes and what are the right measures and what are the right targets for those outcomes, so that they're in absolutely the best interest of children and families, but also they're not creating any perverse incentives, for want of a better expression. But that was sort of baked into our DNA from the start. That was how we started. And then, you know, Kate and Sarah both talked about sort of government role here. You know, we were then fortunate that the government launched a couple of funds, which were outcomes funds that did kind of launch with a vision rather than a top-down, this is what the rate card and the funding structure must be. And we were then able to, with our, you know, fantastic local authority partners as the lead commissioners, but as schools as well, to unlock that funding in alignment with what we had agreed locally. And that has been very effective. It does mean that it creates very, in order to be robust and create the trust locally, it creates quite stringent requirements around shared data and evidence. Because if you're not sharing the data and the evidence to demonstrate to each other how you are all delivering this shared outcomes framework, then you don't have the trust. But when you do, that structure, if you trust that you have the data to show we're delivering these short-term outcomes and indicators, and then we're delivering these long-term outcomes, and over the longer term, that's creating this type of prevention and these types of savings. If you can do that, then you create the space in these contracts at a local level to build trust and to be adaptable and flexible enough to do whatever it takes. And to enable children and families to have what they need. So it's I just come at it from a very grassroots angle.
That's really helpful. Then I suppose comes on nicely to one of the things I did want to touch on, which is around measuring impact and outcomes. And I wonder, Louisa, if you could talk a bit more about that outcomes framework and how you worked with people and how you did identify what the things you wanted to measure were, how you were confident they were the right things that wouldn't create those perverse outcomes, would enable you to support young people. And yeah, I wonder if you could reflect on that.
Sure. There's lots of key things around an outcomes framework, but while we co-design and determine the outcomes framework, first of all, it's also really important to agree who we're working with. And so there's deep work that went into identifying children and young people and their families who will most benefit from this type of community-led system of support and opportunity, and to collecting, as well as the qualitative picture and the story and the context, which Sarah mentioned, which is so important, as the basis of that, having a kind of rigorous data baseline. And for us, we're really thinking about a whole child approach. So you know, you can't divide a child into education, health and social care, right? That's school grades and mental health and family. I know it's really obvious, but so we were wanting to put together an outcomes framework and a local collaboration that would enable us to deliver whole child outcomes. So we talk about social, emotional and academic outcomes. And when we determined that outcomes framework, first of all, that needed to be supported by data and measurement that was appropriate for all of our commissioners. So local authorities have certain things that they need to know, schools have certain things that they need to know. We just want it to be relevant for children and families.
Yeah.
And so that was a whole coming together around what those different measures should be. And over the year, that was the first outcomes framework. Over the years, we have adapted them in different places. So when we moved from Hammersmith and Fulham to Kensington and Chelsea wanted slightly different things. That was right for that context. And so we made some adjustments, and the same across other parts of London. When we started in Wigan and Greater Manchester, we went through a whole deep year-long listening, building trust, relationship building, adjustment of the outcomes framework again. So that it delivered what was most relevant in that context. And that then adjusts the activities that you do as well, that are relevant for context, because there is a lot of need everywhere. There are different assets and systems, not everywhere, but there is deep need in many communities, sorry. It's the assets and the systems frameworks in each place that are different. So once you agree the outcomes framework and you're really clear about who you're working with, then it's about the flex is really in those activities in terms of how you're going to deliver. And yeah, so it's slightly different in each place. That's the point.
Yeah.
It needs to be really contextual. And while our interest is above and beyond children and their outcomes, what we measure and what we can demonstrate in order to build that trust needs to be relevant for all of our commissioners as well. It is possible to do that. It just requires a lot of time and a lot of discussion. And the way contracts work today and the way the system works today, there's often not a lot of time built into things because we've sort of eroded space for this stuff. But that's how we've done.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And I think, yeah, such a good point you made at the end there around it is possible, but it's all partners around the table having the time and the capacity to look at how do we share information, what does good look like in terms of information sharing, rather than, I suppose, what often happens, which is delivering whatever project or program, you know, partners have come around the table for, rather than having the space to do some of that kind of wider system stuff.
And can I just say something slightly more concrete, which is yes, and you know, when I talk about a range of commissioners, if I use examples, you know, schools really want to understand what is driving better attendance when we can deliver better attendance with children. That requires, to Sarah's point, a lot of contextual qualitative information and a deep whole family approach. It's not just that percentage attendance number, but that's critical too. Councils really want our social and emotional measures to talk to what they need, so to be the measures that they use, because there's a deep preventative development here on wider services, right? So we need to be able to line everything up. So, you know, we're constantly thinking about the child, the commissioner, and how it all fits together for everyone.
That's really helpful. And I think that practical example, yeah, really brings to life everyone kind of coming at different angles. But as you say, the value of genuinely hearing that lived experience and doing that consistently throughout delivery, not just at kind of one point in time. Sarah, I wonder if I might come to you and just ask kind of from your experience, how to identify the right things to measure and when you're delivering outcomes to be confident that you're delivering what you want to.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, hearing from Louisa, a very granular local authority, local level, whereas obviously we're looking at a kind of a national adoption. England is a national sort of organisation, and very often when we've got our 5 outcomes, we're looking at building frameworks around them. We try to separate out what the central Adoption England team will do and what the individual REAs would do as part of their sort of evaluation framework. We've always had in our mind sort of outcomes-based accountability. We've always looked at that in terms of how much did we do, how well did we do it, is anybody better off? But the critical element for us is about the involvement of people with lived experience in terms of their what's important to them, what do they want us to measure, you know, improve life chances, stronger relationships. And overall, what we're looking at is kind of increased, I guess, that systemic trust of the adoption sector as a whole, that actually people have trust in the fact that it is delivering what it's setting out to deliver. And trying to get those sort of meaningful evaluation frameworks, you kind of have to co-design that with, we try to get REAs to design that with people in their areas who are involved with them. And we try to do that at a national level. But it does feel that traditional kind of KPIs in terms of the data, you know, we don't always need all of that. We need some of that, absolutely, as to Louisa's point, but actually it's that context and that qualitative information that's really important.
Thank you, Sarah. I can see you nodding a lot there, Kate. I just wondered whether you had anything you wanted to add to that discussion.
I thought Louisa made a fantastic point about needing to fit the evaluatory framework within a local context, and it isn't a one size fits all. And I think what often we get national perspective is that sense of the country's homogenous, that there isn't difference between demography or assets or geography or history, and yet that is the crucial bit of actually getting the evaluation right. So I think we need to use much more of, as Sarah said, a few national KPIs that focus on particular elements that the government need to know, but actually developing most of the impacts at a local level. And that I can I could give you a couple of really good examples of that,
Yeah,
learning from
please.
COVID. Louise's point about data sharing. Often data sharing is used as an excuse, to be quite frank, to not share data or intelligence that citizens actually expect organisations to be sharing. So in COVID, we were able to take away a lot of that unnecessary clinical sort of governance around data sharing, which led to far better strategic intelligence across society, citizen engagement, across public health, across the economy, so that decision makers were actually making decisions on a much richer context of intelligence. Now, we need to not go back into our silos post-COVID, but actually think about how we do that as day-to-day business. And Liverpool City Region are definitely doing that through their civic data collaboration, which brings a rich tapestry of intelligence from the VCSE sector, from academia, from business, right across into a single database across the city region. So that's why I think devolution is really key to unlocking some of those issues and getting more sophisticated, more locally relevant, more citizen relevant impacts on the ground, and actually helping those decisions at a local level. Similarly, there's some work again being led by Liverpool, looking at citizen health and civic health research. So that project that's being led by Ben Barr at Liverpool University, which is just getting underway, I think will be really helpful in terms of the future design of evaluatory frameworks. But we must get away from measuring widgets and must get into that kind of citizen engagement. Project I was also involved in with Salford University was called Communities in Charge of Alcohol. That made use of citizen researchers, so training up citizens to be their own researchers and evaluators and actually challenge back into decision makers. That has been written up many times. We've done quite a few journal articles on it. Very, very successful in actually co-designing, but also nurturing skills of citizens to actually hold the system to account. And I think that's really important.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, really interesting. There's some really interesting examples there. I wanted to ask, I suppose we talked about this at the beginning around leadership and the role of leaders in gripping and delivering outcomes. And to your example there, Kate, of COVID, where I think we saw quite decisive leadership in places. I know I worked on a COVID project and a lot of the bureaucracy and blockers that existed day to day suddenly went away overnight, and it felt like we could get things done and deliver them really quickly. But I wanted to ask Kate, what role you feel leaders play in gripping and driving outcomes, and what some of the key attributes you see leaders needing to have in that role.
I think leadership needs to be horizontal rather than hierarchical, for starters. And I think one of the lessons we had from the Wigan deal was very much that mutual conversation, respect between professionals, politicians, and the public. And it has to be that three-way engagement. Culture, as we all know, eats strategy for breakfast, so we can have all the lovely strategies we like around engagement or around evaluation, but the culture of the organisation, the culture of the place is absolutely crucial. And that means going on a listening exercise in the way that both Louisa and Sarah were describing. You've got to do in-depth, really engaged listening. One of the things I think that really helps with this and helps leaders respond in a better way is actually ethnographic and anthropological training. I've always said the NHS needs a chief anthropologist to teach it how to talk to people, which may sound rather pejorative, but is actually important. We tend to have focus on professional power and status when actually we should be thinking about an open mind to how we engage with our fellow citizens. And one of the at the heart of the Wigan deal was actually changing the culture of the organisation to do just that. Everybody going through ethnographic training, everybody being sent out to have individual human-to-human conversations. Now, leaders do set the tone for an organisation. They have to be able to share power, so that it's that concept of servant leadership. They have to be prepared to listen and be challenged, often on a daily basis, and to also, I think, set the pay, if you like, the pay, reward and incentivisation. Too often organisations tend to be very risk averse and minimise the opportunities for frontline staff to be innovative. One of the things that came back very strongly in the King's Fund independent report on the Wigan deal was from Dan Wellings and Chris Naylor, the two researchers, and they came back to me after the first day they'd been in Wigan and said, whatever else the Wigan deal has done, you have given, you the organisation, you have given your staff their vocation back. And that's an old-fashioned word, vocation, but it's what gets people out of bed in the morning to go and do public service, work in the voluntary sector, to go the extra mile. And actually freeing people up to actually, you know, be able to enjoy the work they do and to innovate is really, really crucial. That morale boosting bit of feeling, you know, I'm actually making a positive difference, a positive contribution. And the problem with lots of performance management is we actually crush the vocation, we crush out the imagination and the innovation that the most important people in organisations have. And that's on the front line. But crucially, we also crush the imagination and creativity of our citizens. And alongside the Wigan deal, if you like, in terms of the organisation, was the deal for Communities Investment Fund, where we were channeling investment, small amounts, it might be skills, it might have been money, into local community groups to nurture the ideas and creativity they have. That is what being a coordinator, a strategic leader of place for local government can and should be doing.
Thank you, Kate. That's really interesting. And I've read that King's Fund evaluation of the Wigan deal. It's incredible what you managed to achieve there. I suppose, what do you think was key in making that happen? Was it the leadership at the top in the organisation in terms of enabling and empowering staff to work differently? What do you think? How do you think that happened?
It was, I think it was twofold, Anya. I think it was the politicians themselves going on a journey from, if you like, benign paternalism to thinking we've got to take the public into our confidence. Now that's quite a brave thing, but that was, you know, down to the leadership of Lord Smith of Lea, who was then the council leader, and taking his cabinet through that. Interestingly, that became a very much cross-party approach as well. So it wasn't, you know, sort of one political party buying into that. It was all the parties buying into that. That had to be supported by the management, professional leadership in the organisation as well. So very much from the chief exec, you know, Donna Hall leading that approach. And then really embedding that through your HR and OD processes. And I think that HR and OD are very, very underrated in terms of their importance in culture change. And look, we looked at recruitment and retention, we looked at pay and reward, we looked about how we inducted people into the leadership of place, and we shared that with other organisations. So I think the best anecdote I can give you on this one was one of our GPs, Sanjay Wahi, who is a gentleman of few words normally, but whatever he has to say is always well worth listening to. And when the King's Fund report was being presented to our Healthier Wigan partnership, Sanjay, you know, sort of Sanjay's comment on this was, before the deal, I was very proud to be, you know, a GP, to work for the NHS. You know, that's always been part of my identity. And I think we sometimes forget how important the roles are to people's identity. He said, after the deal, after I've been through the deal and, you know, linked up with our local head teachers and seen the importance of working in place, he said, I'm still proud to be a doctor and a GP and work for the NHS, but I'll tell you what I'm much more proud of, and that's being a member of #Team Wigan. And I think that, what better example of seeing yourself as part of the membership and team of place.
Thank you, Kate. And I suppose that also points to people seeing their role as a leader, even if they're not a chief exec or, you know, a political leader. It's actually, how does everyone feel? Yeah, that responsibility and want to kind of make that change. And that comes back to the empowerment point, doesn't it? I wonder, Sarah, if I can come to you in terms of the role of leaders in gripping and driving outcomes. And I wonder if you've got reflect both leading the kind of implementation of the first RAA, but then also now in your role kind of nationally across national adoption as well.
Yeah, thanks, Anya. Kate, I could listen to you for ages. It's so fascinating to listen to. I think from my point of view, leadership is absolutely crucial in the work that we've been doing. And I think at all levels, leadership is at all levels. So, you know, we talk about staff who have the ability to lead and change the culture in their teams. We use champions, and they're often leaders of a particular practice area in their local area. But leadership, I guess at where I work, we meet with the regional adoption agency leaders once a month. The relationship that I have with the RA leaders is very important. It builds trust. We talk together, we openly address, support each other, challenge each other. We learn from our mistakes where things haven't gone well. We allow that kind of learning culture. So I think the culture is really, really important in terms of the tone of that. I think values-based leadership is really important. People, you know, I'm certainly a believer in listening to people, being very humble, empathizing, treating people with fairness is really, really important. People like to see leaders being fair to people. And I think particularly that respect for people with lived experience and modeling how you would want people to maybe run their organization, or particularly this issue about involving people with lived experience. We've certainly done quite a lot of work around amplifying voices of people with lived experience to model what you could potentially do in a different area. And I also think working across organizations, so we work very strongly in partnership with other agencies who deliver similar work, like voluntary adoption agencies. We work with the board chairs of all the different regional adoption agencies to really kind of align our vision and to be clear that actually what we're trying to do is really kind of improve services for children and families at the end of the day. But that sort of cross partnership working is really important. But I think it comes down to trust. People need to trust you. They need to feel that they can be vulnerable with you, and that you've kind of got their back. But I also think there's something about decisiveness, and actually at certain times, depending on the issues, you need to either be very decisive, but also to bring people with you. So I think it's been a really interesting journey looking at leadership at different levels and how you need to kind of have similar attributes, but look at it slightly differently depending on the role that you're doing.
Thanks, Sarah. And I suppose also the maturity of the organisation or team or group of people that you're leading, because I imagine that would have looked very different in the early days of the regional adoption agencies versus to now.
Yeah, very different. And I think also when you're leading a sort of, you know, the regional adoption agencies have sometimes got 10 local authorities that they're working with. Some of them have got 2, and you've got a leader who's come in and never worked across boundaries. That can be quite a big thing for people. So I think we've done quite a lot of work on providing leadership skills, peer support sort of opportunities for people to learn from each other, which I think has really helped develop sort of leadership skills that kind of creates that trust, and people being able to pick up the phone and say, I don't know what I'm doing. What do you know what you're doing? And as you say, it's changed. Lots of people have just recently retired, so we've got a whole new wave of new leaders coming in. So it feels like we're going around some of the same sort of conversations that we were having a few years ago.
Thank you, Sarah. And Louisa, I wanted to come to you. I know you'll have views on kind of the role of leaders, but yeah, what do you think the role of leaders are? And I suppose also to something you spoke a bit about earlier in terms of the work that you do with partner organisations as part of All Child. How do you kind of balance your leadership alongside working with schools and other organisations who will also have their kind of focus on what they want to deliver?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to say something different to what Kate and Sarah have already said, which is I totally agree with, and it's all brilliant. I mean, thinking about it in terms of how to empower our frontline workers, again, I don't love that expression, but on the ground, I guess you know, our approach is that everyone is a leader and everyone needs to be a leader, and that means really equipping our teams and our partners with what they need to do their best for, you know, that child, that family, that school, that community in every situation to enable better outcomes. And that is a lot about culture, yeah, and a lot about values and values alignment. And that can be really challenging at the local level. I mean, you know, as an example, you know, we have link workers based full-time in school that are employees. We are, you know, values driven. Our values need to sit within every school's values, every school's behaviour policy. And then you know, you've got a council's values as well. So it's about being really equipping our teams with really a clear and deep understanding of our mission and our values, but also all of our partners' mission and their values, and where we can adapt and where we can flex. And again, that requires really robust frameworks underneath that everybody's bought into, and that's where the outcomes frameworks come in. Because if we all focus on the outcomes and on the child in the end, we'll get there. And that needs to give everybody the flexibility to do, as I say, what every individual child and context need. It does require real rigor around professional boundaries. It requires real rigor around safeguarding. And again, real rigor around data sharing, like absolutely unforgiving rigor. And I think with frontline teams, maybe, you know, that's the thing I can add, you know, working to targets and outcomes to deliver into outcomes contracts. You know, we talk about that in our interviews with our link workers. We talk about that with our partners. We don't talk about commissioning our charity partners. We talk about joining our collective approach. And we talk about that up front because it means being really transparent about data and being open and honest when things aren't going that well, and not being competitive about it. It's not a competition. It's about you know, the best thing for those children and families. And there is a real tension between doing deep relational work and the role of trust in all of this, and that's key. I mean, I can show you the data that shows when we have a change of link worker within a 2-year program, children don't get this as good outcomes. Like, so it's building that trust, but also working to targets, like, and everyone who works as part of our model, you know, it's part of the job to collect data, share data, be transparent about it, you know, see where you're at. It might not be where you want to be at, in which case ask for help. And I won't repeat what Sarah said about learning culture and asking for help, and, you know, learning partnerships rather than top-down evaluations. I'm not going to get sidetracked. I'm going to stop at that one. But those are some of the things that I think are important on the ground.
Thank you, Louise. That's really helpful. And I suppose just a follow-up question from me, because I suppose sometimes what you hear is the people saying, I don't have the time to, you know, make space for that learning or make space for that rigor or spend time, you know, doing deep analysis of this or filling out this form or that sort of thing. How do you tackle that? Is it being kind of absolutely embedded from the outset so that people know that's a core part of their role?
It's embedded from the outset. So I think it was Sarah, okay, I'm not sure who talked about training relational one-to-ones. I mean, everyone is trained from the outset in this kind of community-led way of working, positive engagement, relational building approach. So that's embedded from the outset, and then working to targets and data is embedded from the outset as well. And there's a constant tension. It's complicated bringing those two things together, and that's where it requires culture and leadership, as you said, and deep training. But it's in our DNA, and we enter every partnership with that approach. As I say, recruitment of our link workers, but also our charity partners, and you know, how we're going to work with schools as well, and councils' early help teams on the ground.
Thank you, Louisa, really helpful. And then we touched on this a bit, but I wanted to reflect on that balance between local and national delivery. And Sarah, I can see you smiling. I might come to you first. But what do you think the right balance is? And I appreciate that's a bit of like a how long is a piece of string question, but what are some of the things you think absolutely make sense at a national level, at a local level? How do those things balance so you can deliver the right outcomes for people?
Yeah, it's a good question, Anya, and one that we often reflect on. So I think generally speaking, nationally, we kind of focus really on the outcomes and kind of the objectives, whereas the local or the regional, in our case, often determines the priorities within those outcomes and how they do it, ensuring that they can kind of deliver that sort of locally, but it gives us coherence and innovation across the whole system. So just to give you an example, at a national level, we set sort of frameworks or national practice standards which focus on kind of principles, frameworks to sort of ensure that we kind of get equity and consistency across adoption practice, for example, and the services. Whereas if we do sort of grant funding for regions around specific innovation, we focus on those national priorities, but we allow people to be really clear about what their needs are in their region so that they can be really flexible about kind of innovation. And then I think I touched on this on my last question, really, around, one of our key national outcomes is that experts by experience are very much involved at all stages of shaping delivery, shaping practice, and that we have those people involved in all of our working groups. We have reference groups, we have youth forums, and I think we try to model examples of how you might do it at a national level, basically to try and help the regions think of ideas about how they could potentially do it, but put it to their sort of local context. So I think it's a tricky one, and sometimes I think there's a tension between kind of what we might want nationally, and we might want to go fast. Whereas actually the scale and pace of change that's going on across services at the moment, right across all domains, means that actually sometimes they say, no, slow down. So actually we have to have that continuous sort of dialogue, but that's still remaining firm on our kind of vision. And actually, I think what we've noticed is that some REAs will want to really move more quickly and others actually can't because of their local context and the constraints of their local area, and we have to be kind of understanding of that, but still I think keep a key focus on what we're trying to do for children and families at all points. So it's a tricky one.
Thank you so much. It is. I asked the question knowing that there's not really a straightforward answer, and I think you're totally right in that kind of that strain or finding that balance between national and local, and actually sometimes things that when you're maybe a step further back at a national level seem straightforward are not straightforward at all when you then think about it in the local context in terms of lots of reform transformation we know is going on across various parts of local services at the moment. So I think really important to reflect. Kate, I wonder if I could come to you, and I know you've talked a bit about this already, but particularly with your kind of health hat on, your reflections on kind of balancing delivery of outcomes at a local and a national level and what you think good looks like.
I think at a national level, things like, for example, halving the gap in healthy life expectancy is a very laudable outcome measure, and actually absolutely what the government should be, addressing and tackling. How you do that is going to be very different at a local level. And I think what national government can do is look at where there are perverse incentives, and I think we've touched on this, for example, in terms of some of the funding structures, the silos between funding, funding for activity as opposed to outcome, that actually merging things into things like a place-based budget would be really, really helpful at a neighbourhood level, at a combined authority level. And you're seeing some of that starting to come into the English devolution white paper. So I think devolution is a really important mechanism for actually smoothing the path between the centralised national target and national outcome measures through to local delivery. It's also, certainly from the experience in Greater Manchester, really good for looking at where you might have economies of scale across 10 authorities, perhaps rather linking into the way Sarah described, the work of Adoption England. The point there being that you can get some sensible outcomes for the whole of a sub-region or a city region, and then that mustn't sort of override. It must be complementary to the measures and delivery at a local level. And I think Peter Smith actually summed it up beautifully for me in terms of Greater Manchester. He said, the thing we have to pull off is how we improve everybody, so we support people, support every place in Greater Manchester to be the best they can, without interfering in individual boroughs' autonomy. So it's about respecting the autonomy of boroughs, but also having that collective goal to be the best that we can be. And that is about absolutely crucial, is about relationship building and mature political debate across a place. And one of the things I would say is that Restate are doing a series of interviews with the Metro mayors, which I've been listening to. And it's really interesting to hear their perspectives about their role as conveners of place. And they're very strong on those kind of relationships. The duty that's in the devolution bill for health is actually to reduce health inequalities. So there actually is an inequalities duty, and perhaps the role more of that putting duties on place and duties on combined authorities is the route to go, rather than, if you like, traditional KPIs. Put a duty and a responsibility, match that with the funding devolved in terms of decision making, and then hold people to account. And I think the mayors are going to be held to account through a parliamentary committee, as well as the ballot box. That is perhaps the route to go. So we need to look at a better use of local democracy and a better use of duty and power and powers to places devolved with the funding, rather than traditional KPIs and evaluatory frameworks. In other words, top-down performance management, we know, hasn't created an equal society. In fact, we've got the largest gap in healthy life expectancy since we started recording that measure at the present time. So an over-centralised system does not deliver equal outcomes. Perhaps a devolved system with a more sophisticated approach to duties, powers, funding and decision making, and that true engagement of citizens in those decisions as close to the person as possible is a better route to go. But that does mean people being prepared to surrender power nationally, and of course professional power structures need challenging too.
Thank you, Kate. That's, really helpful reflections. And I think that comes back to some of the discussion we've already had around trust and the culture. And actually there needs to be that trust, doesn't there, at that national level, that that local communities and local leaders do understand what their communities want, what their communities need, and have those relationships to deliver at a local level. I was just going to come quickly to you, Louisa, and ask if there's any other kind of reflections you wanted to share on delivery at that national and local context, particularly for yourself at All Child and the kind of hyper local work that you do.
I don't think I've got anything to add. Kate and Sarah are really eloquent. I would have gone where Kate went, which was power devolved with funding by place and engagement of people closest to making the decisions.
Bro, I'm going to actually come to a question before we wrap up in the chat. And someone's asked, should we not commission and fund to learn? That way we iterate to what matters to local people and communities, anchoring our data in real life context and achieving real feedback of outcomes that are being achieved or not. And that can then inform what works and what doesn't. I don't know if anyone's got any, well, Louise, I don't know if you've got any reflections.
Yeah, I do actually on this one, because we have commissioned a learning partnership with Coram in Wigan, very differently to how we commissioned evaluation of our work in West London through several years of learning around this. And we're 1 year into it and we've already learned so much from it. And young people are conducting a lot of the research and taking to, was it Kate or Sarah's point, an ethnographic approach, as well as, our outcomes data. And they've really, the young people themselves have explored how we listened and co-designed and got to where we've got to in terms of the way we started working. how we've engaged and how children and families feel about it. And it's been incredibly powerful, and we've applied a lot of what we've learned across to where we're working in London and starting up in new places. So I think it's really critical, but I think it needs to be done in a way, again, that devolves power and involves the right people and is shared very, very transparently.
Thank you, Louisa. Before I wrap us up, I was going to do a quick fire kind of final reflection from each of you. So what would be your one piece of advice for people who are delivering and feel like they're a bit stuck or they've lost sight of the overall outcomes they're trying to achieve? Kate, I might come to you first. Oh, you're on mute, Kate. Oh, you're still on mute, I think. Maybe I'll come to Sarah first for her quick piece of advice, and then I can come back to Kate.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kate sort of alluded to this earlier on, but it's this issue about culture. And you know, I think the culture of the organisation, the leadership, is so important in terms of how you look at that kind of issue between local delivery and national delivery. So I think that would probably be my one piece of advice. And I've forgotten the actual strapline. Is it culture eats strategy for breakfast? Something like that. Yeah, that's the one. That would be my piece of advice.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll go to Louisa next, just in case Kate is still having trouble with her mute. What would be your one piece of advice, Louisa, for people who are in the throes of delivery and feel like they're a bit stuck or they're losing sight of the overall outcome they're trying to achieve?
Listen. That would be my one piece of advice. Outcomes contracts have a reputation for being really, you know, all about data, inflexible, difficult, transactional. Actually, they can create the maximum flexibility to deliver what people need if they're used really well and they're designed really well. But the most important thing around them is that train everybody in active listening, everybody involved, and deploy it. Actively listen.
Thank you. Yeah, you answered it perfectly with one word. That was very good. I'm not sure, Kate, if you are able to unmute, but if not, I can see you shaking your head. So we'll never know what Kate's one piece of advice would be. But I'm sure it would have been very useful, and plenty of other really useful advice that Kate shared today. So I thank you all. That's been a really interesting discussion, and I'm going to wrap us up now. I think there's been lots of food for thought throughout the discussion. Some things that really stood out to me include the importance of enabling and empowering local communities to shape delivery, including points all of the panelists made around really listening and engaging with people with lived experience and bringing them in to shape what delivery and outcomes look like throughout programs and projects. And also really the value of partners across a place in supporting delivery and thinking about outcomes from the outset, as well as really supporting staff through training and peer support so that they can be involved and see themselves as leaders in delivery and delivering outcomes. So thank you all again for joining, and thanks to our wonderful panelists for sharing your reflections. We'll have our final webinar in the series on the 27th of November, which will be focused on learning. So look out for the sign up for that, and hopefully see you all there. Thank you again to our panelists. Have a lovely rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.